and stalk that it throws up. And the capsules produce spores, tiny balls of cells that get carried away by the wind and then will land somewhere. And if they land somewhere suitable, it will be able to grow a new plant. What's also interesting about this particular species is its leaves. And as you can see in the inset there, each leaf ends in a white hair point, a white hair. And what that does is it enables it to capture and hold on to as much water as possible, because living on a wall is clearly a very dry environment. And this particular species, this is one that really thrives in our cities. I very rarely see it out in the wider countryside. So it's made a real success of being a pioneer of our cities. The next habitat is lowland woodland, the sort of woodland we find in the broader countryside and within our cities as well. And this is an image that I took in a bit of woodland near me in Plymouth. And the story I want to tell you here is a story about air pollution and one of our success stories in trying to make our environment better. The species of moss and liverwort, as we'll see, which grow on trees, really suffered very badly from acid rain, and they were driven out of a lot of their range. But since we've taken action to cut down acid rain, this was back in the 80s and 90s, I guess, all those species are now really bouncing back, and there's an ongoing recovery. And here's the first of this sort of species that lives on trees. You might be able to find quite easily, Lateral Crifea. The picture on the left there, it's a picture of a tree bark, and as you can see, it's covered in masses of branches of this particular species. And each branch usually has several capsules on it. In this case, the capsules are quite short. They don't have stalks at all, as you can see in the inset image there. But that does make it very recognizable. There's not any other species that really look anything like this. And you should be able to find it quite easily on trees in cities and towns and in the countryside. This species, forked veilwort, another species that grows on trees, is our first liverwort. Liverworts are a group of plants that evolved around 400 million years ago, about the same time as mosses, perhaps slightly earlier, and they tend to get lumped together when we're talking about these ancient groups of plants. In this case, you can see it doesn't even have leaves. It just has these strips of green tissue, which are about 1 or 2 millimeters wide. But it's very easy to spot when you're walking through woodland, because as you can see on the picture on the left there, it forms these roughly circular patches, which really do stand out. And you can spot those quite easily. Right, now on to our third habitat. We're now on the edges of the moors in some of the river valleys, and this is temperate rainforest. And you've probably read quite a bit about this recently. It's become quite a big thing. You may have read Guy Shrubsole's book, which came out a couple of years ago. The story here is about how bryophyte species can be an indicator of good quality habitat. So a few years ago, I was involved with a project with Plant Life. This is a charity that tries to work to preserve our native flora. And we were training up people to recognize certain species of moss and liverwort because they were really good indicators of really good quality temperate rainforest. And the people would go out and try to look for some of these species. And the first of these is Tamarisk scalewort. It's a liverwort. You can find a similar species on trees in the lowland, but in the upland, in rainforest, in good quality habitat where there's a lot of moisture, it forms these wonderful bushy patches, which really help us recognize it, and it's a good indicator of high quality habitat. The next species, rustwort, as its name suggests, has a wonderful rusty color, as is illustrated by the picture on the right there. But what is not clear for its scale on those shoots and max in size it makes up for in sheer abundance. And on the right sort of habitat, it grows on rotting tree logs. It can absolutely cover those logs and trunks and can put on a wonderful show. And it's a good habitat indicator because it needs the moisture, and also it needs well-managed woodland in that it's woodland that's not tidied up, that there's plenty of dead wood lying there. So that's a really wonderful species to see. And I'm going to finish up now on moorland. Wonderful for bryophytes, loads of mosses and liverworts that live there. I could talk for ages. Obviously, my time is limited, so I won't. But I am going to talk a little bit about sphagnum mosses. These are the mosses that we're going to talk about a lot more later on. We have 38 species in the country. We have important species for storing carbon. And they're actually in this picture on the right here. There's the red one, and also hidden away, there's near the bottom of the patch, there are some pale brown, quite chunky mosses, which is the second one. Those pale green shoots are a third species of sphagnum moss. And on the right there, you can see a shoot of sphagnum. It grows from the tip. So right at the tip there, there's a compact mass of branches with a growing tip. And as it grows, the stem elongates and the branches become more separated. And that sinks down into the bog. And there it's a wonderful store of carbon, because that's really the story about sphagnum mosses, these sort of ecosystem services that they give to us. Story about storing carbon and also holding on to water for us. And I'm going to leave you with a couple of pictures of particular species of sphagnum moss, the two that are really important, most important for storing carbon. The easy one to recognize is red bog moss. If you get onto a nice bit of bog, it has a wonderful wine red color and quite easy to pick out because it forms clumps and patches and hummocks. The other one is perhaps a little less easy to spot, Papalos bog moss, but it's another really, really important one. So there you are. Thank you for that. And I shall now hand you back to Naomi.
Thank you very much, Tim. That's a brilliant, I know it's a quick whiz through. There's thousands of species, but we would love you to come back and tell us more about other mosses, or we
absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Do show people more. So thank you very much. And from the pavement up on top of the moor, there's so much in and around where people live in towns, as well as finding their way from the city up there and exploring the top there. That is just such a lot to get inspired by, isn't it? Have we got any questions about mosses? Not yet. Everybody carry on using the chat if you would like to, and we can bring up questions and talk about it as we go. The second person, thanks Tim, we'll move on now, and we have Martin Gillard from the Dartmoor National Park as an archaeologist, as part of the Southwest Peatland Partnership as well, and he has so many moss stories to tell about the history that's held within the peat and on the moor. So I'll hand over to Martin, and we look forward to hearing more, Martin.
Right, thank you very much. I can't promise any exciting interruptions like during the last talk, we've heard Tim talking about the moss. We've seen lots of images of that moss as it's growing, and I suppose a lot of my work is involved with the peat, which is what the moss becomes after it's stopped growing. Let's see now. Can I get my slides to move on? There we go. But the other thing, of course, I'm going to talking about Dartmoor. I've got 10 minutes to cover about 10,000 years of great range of human activity. We have an aerial shot here of prehistoric fields and settlements, probably dating from the Bronze Age, and the preservation and the extent of these on Dartmoor is something on a sort of international scale of importance. And the other sort of archaeology of Dartmoor on a similar sort of scale and significance is the history of extracting tin from Dartmoor as well. There's a shot here of some waste heaps left behind by tin streaming. That's been going on for thousands of years. Again, something that's like those Bronze Age landscapes, those extensive landscapes. This is also something that's very rare to find elsewhere, mainly for geological reasons. The obvious other places on the granite uplands of Cornwall, and I'll be talking about them a bit as well. But huge amounts of Dartmoor is covered under a thick layer of peat, and here's an example of it. Actually, not actually that thick, really. That scale in the middle is about 1 meter. So we're looking about 1.5 meters, 2 meters there. There are deposits of peat, sometimes much thicker, 4 or 5 meters in places. And they're created, this isn't simply soil as you and I would find in our garden, but they're created when those mosses, those sphagnums and other plants, when they die in very in wet and often cold conditions, they don't rot away like other things do, like things would do, say, in our garden, but they are preserved by those conditions, and that's why store of carbon, because they're organic material that sucks that carbon out of the atmosphere, but because it hasn't rotted away, it's preserved. But unfortunately, in places like this, where you can see it's eroding, then that will be releasing the carbon again. Which is why we've got peatland restoration projects. But anyway, that's not something for me to talk about at this time. But these layers of peat often developed in the Bronze Age and later, 3,000 years ago, and they actually covered over, in some cases, the remains of past human activity. There's this image here. Can we see that line? There's obviously a road there. That's the road from Princetown down to Tavistock, but also this road this line running parallel to it is the Walkhampton Reeve. A reeve is a prehistoric boundary dating back to the Bronze Age, 3,000 years ago, something like that. And particularly on the southern moor, there's great lengths of these and field systems associated with them. I could wax lyrical for an hour or so about them, but obviously I'm not going to now. But a point I'm making here, can we see sort of up at the top right here, the reeve almost disappears, and it's partly because it's eroding, but partly because it's been covered by peat. A lot of this peat has developed after this peak of human activity on the moor, so things are often hidden beneath it. This stone here, is it a standing stone? Well, it's a stone that's standing, isn't it? And if it is a standing stone, our ancestors in the Bronze Age, maybe the late Neolithic period, the late Stone Age, 3,000 to 4,000 years, stood these stones up. I can't begin starting to discuss why this might be in this time, but this feature I found, it wasn't previously recorded, and it actually sits in a Victorian peat cutting, because of course people also use peat as a fuel because it's organic material. It can be dried out and burnt. So it's an example where you have this older human activity covered over by the peat and then revealed again by later disturbance. And there's a sort of shot of it looking a bit lonely there on the slopes of Ammercombe Hill on the northwest of Dartmoor. The scale that's always in my photographs is 1 meter long, to give you an idea of size. And there are other examples of this. Stone Row at Cut Hill, Stone Circle at Sitterford. These are examples of prehistoric monuments which have been covered over by the later development of peat. And another sort of feature, another structure, if you like, this was the kist. A kist is a stone box used in prehistory for a burial or a cremation to be stored in, to be put in. And this was on Whitehorse Hill on the northern moor, found in the noughties, eroding out of the peat there. And it's the only example of a kist which has been sort of excavated with modern techniques. And it shows superbly the quality of peat for preserving organic materials. This is a wickerwork basket that was found in there. It's about 3,000 years old, preserved in that peat for all that time. Another example, these wooden artifacts, we're not quite sure what they are. Are they buttons? Are they toggles? Are they even spacers for flesh piercings, for sort of put in your ears or something like that? We don't know. But they're spindle wood, and looking closely at them, we can tell they've been turned to make them, spun around. They're the oldest examples of wood turning found in Northern Europe, preserved in that peat of Dartmoor. And another fantastic object that was found there, these are beads made of tin. I'm sure they would have been much brighter at the time. And this bracelet is made of nettle fibre, surviving 3,500 years. Take yourself down to the box, Plymouth Museum. You can see these artifacts, or at the visitor centre at Postbridge, you've got replicas of them as well. But going in on a smaller scale again, peat is excellent at preserving these things. And here we have examples of pollen that's preserved in peat. And of course, if we can tell the mixtures of pollen that are there, we can tell us something about the environment that was there in the past. And why have I got this picture here of a pile of a cowpat? These fungi will only grow on cowpats, and their spores, again, are preserved in the peat. And from the varying levels of those spores, we can basically tell how many animals were on the moor, how big herds of cattle or sheep people were keeping there. So it's this record of our relationship with our landscape, with Dartmoor. And it being in that column of peat, because peat is organic, we can date it. Carbon-14 dating. There's not time to explain how it works, but we can tell how old those layers of peat are, so we can see those changes in our landscape. We can take samples out of them. This is a sample being taken. I must admit, this one was being bored out on Bodmin Moor on the north side of a place called Pridicum Down, a couple miles from Jamaica Inn. The peat is being taken out. It's about 3 meters deep. And you can look at all those pollens and things I was talking about and get an idea of the landscape. I can't talk in detail about it, but basically the dark green indicates trees, the pink is dwarf shrubs, the green is grasses. We can see how that landscape changes. But here's another little thing. How am I doing for time? I'm all right, aren't I? Look at the date.
Got another minute or so.
How exciting. Look at the date that we've got here. That is 10,700 years ago. That column of peat, the very earliest parts of it, dated back about 12,000 years to the end of the last ice age. An unbroken record of that environment and how we as humans were interacting with it. And this came out of the peat down near the bottom of that sequence. Twigs, bits of leaf. We can see those leaves there. Those are leaves dating back thousands of years, preserved in that peat. That's the potential, if that peat is in good condition, that we can learn that story of our environment and how we were interacting with it, dating back over thousands of years. And there we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry to say I do have to fly off. If there are questions for me, maybe you could forward them to me.
Yeah, of course.
And I will do my best.
But such a lovely. I know it's a speedy taster of all that peat moorlands can hold as histories of our land and landscape. So
if there's any questions now, I've got a few minutes. If we're
Does anybody want to ask Martin a question? Otherwise, we'll. They're all saying thank you very much. And
thank you. You're welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah. So thank you. So we've heard the story of all the different species growing from the pavement up to the moor. Then we've heard some of that real long history. You know, there's only a millimetre of sphagnum peat growing per year, so that 3 meters is and more is 12,000 years of history held. So that's what we've done so far. The next speaker, Scott Davidson, has been analysing the peat and the role of the mosses for a few years. I mean, he's doing all sorts of interesting research, but I'm going to hand over to him and he can explain his story of what the peat and the mosses are telling us.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Hi, so yeah, thank you very much, Naomi, and everyone for inviting me today to speak about one of my favorite topics in the world, peatlands and sphagnum moss. And so today I'm going to present, the wonders of sphagnum moss, as it's kind of been alluded to so far tonight, and why they're so good at storing carbon and what makes peatlands so important. And at the end, I'll touch on a kind of cool citizen science project that has a slightly arty theme to it that might be of interest to the people in the room, or the virtual room. So to start off with just a very brief introduction to who I am. I'm Dr. Scott Davidson. I'm a lecturer in ecosystem resilience at the University of Plymouth. I lead the Wetland Resilience Research Group. Actually, one of my PhD students is in the room, Emma, which is nice to see. And so my research is focused on kind of my elevator pitch is the response, the recovery, and the resilience of peatland ecosystems to change globally. So I'm very, very fortunate that I get to work in some fantastic, beautiful peatlands across the Northern Hemisphere, across Canada, Alaska, and Northern Europe. And now that I'm back in the UK, I'm from Scotland originally, but sometimes my accent tries to tell otherwise. I'm working on some local peatlands as well here in the southwest, but very, very lucky to work in some beautiful, beautiful landscapes. And so to start off with, as we know, and we've probably heard quite a lot in the media recently, peatlands are incredibly important, but historically they have been underappreciated and overutilized. And so we've thought of them historically as a wasteland, areas that we can just drain readily, but we're beginning to get to the point where we realize just how important these ecosystems are. And so peatlands are one of the largest natural terrestrial carbon stores in the world. They don't get shouted out about as much as rainforests or other kind of ecosystems, but they're incredibly important. And they store around 550 billion tons of carbon in their soil. And this is around 21% of all the global soil organic carbon stock, which basically equates to storing more carbon than all other vegetation types in the world combined. So they're incredibly important ecosystems, and they are what we call as a nature-based solution to climate change. That is harnessing the power of nature to help us fight climate change. And peatlands are probably one of the best players in that battle. So why do peatlands store so much carbon relative to other ecosystems? I'm going to take you back, hopefully, maybe to some high school biology, but if you look at this diagram here, we've got an ecosystem with some plants and some soil. And the carbon stored in a typical ecosystem is a balance between the input through photosynthesis, through plants or mosses, and the decomposition from microbes. But what makes peatlands unique is that they are saturated or they're waterlogged. And so there's a lot of water in them. They're wetlands, they're a type of wetland. And so this means that soil will lack oxygen, and that can really slow down that rate of plant decomposition. So you see there, the arrow gets smaller, those waterlogged conditions hold on to that carbon. And so normally plants will lose their leaves and they'll decompose and they'll release carbon back to the atmosphere. And the balance between what's coming in and what's coming out helps us understand how much carbon these ecosystems are storing. But these waterlogged conditions means that over tens of thousands of years, dead plants accumulate, build up on top of each other to form peat, as shown in this photo here. So this is a peat core. And this allows them to store carbon for long, long periods of time. And we think of it as that the input is greater than the output. And so these sites are a carbon store or a carbon sink. So they're holding on to their carbon rather than releasing it like a typical other kind of ecosystem, such as a woodland or a grassland. So sphagnum is one of the best ways to make peat. It's one of the best species to form peat. I will say that nearly every kind of vegetation in the right conditions can make peat, but sphagnum is one of the best ones. They're incredibly important mosses. I think one of the most important organisms in the world. I often tell my students that we should focus on sphagnum and not pandas when it comes to what we save in the world, because they're incredibly important. And to be honest, not only are they important, but they're damn beautiful. I spend a lot of my time taking photographs of mosses, especially sphagnum. And so sphagnum moss has some impressive and maybe kind of unsuspecting characteristics. It can hold 20 times its own weight in water. It keeps the ground wet throughout the year. It holds that water at the soil surface. And so it makes it a foundational species of many peatland habitats. I kind of think of it as sphagnum growing on mats across the ground. It's very acidic, and the sphagnum mosses grow year on year, and it compresses it down into the water table, and so traps that carbon in there. It doesn't let that vegetation decompose as you might find in another kind of ecosystem. And so again, I kind of explain to my students that I think of sphagnum growing on the bodies of its dead brothers and sisters because it just pushes everything down and keeps on going. And that lends sphagnum moss its greatest and most useful characteristic, I think, with the formation of peat, as mentioned previously by Martin. And so, like I said, peat is formed by layers upon layers of sphagnum moss growing over thousands of years. And so roughly 1 meter of moss might equate to 1,000 years of stored carbon and plant matter. And sadly, in Dartmoor, a lot of the peatlands are disturbed, but there's a lot of fantastic work happening in the Southwest, especially by the Southwest Peatland Partnership on trying to restore these ecosystems. And we're not very fortunate in the UK to have many areas that are intact still, but there are places up in north of Scotland in the Flow Country, which is the largest expanse of blanket bog in Europe and potentially the world, which have peat reaching up to 10 meters. So it just shows the scale of how long those peatlands have been on the landscape. They're incredibly important ecosystems. And so it's kind of like that was just a little whistle-stop tour into why sphagnum is so important. It's an incredible species. And like I said, I think we should care more about sphagnum and less about some of these more charismatic megafauna. And it's the small scale that actually really impacts the big scale. So I'm going to link into this kind of idea. As you saw from my photographs previously, sphagnum are incredibly beautiful colors. They come in a variety of colors. And that kind of gave me the idea for this project I'm going to explain now, which is looking at how peatlands change color over time. And so given this is a community of people interested in art, I thought I'd highlight this creative community science project that I created a few years ago. So a little bit of background just to get you up to speed. I'm looking at phenology with this, and phenology is basically a word used to describe the development of how a plant changes over the course of its life history. This could be when it flowers, when the buds break, when it fruits, or in my case, the greening up and then the browning of vegetation over time. And we know from a scientific point of view, the phenology of leaf traits, so the greenness, when it becomes greenest and when it starts to turn brown, are really important drivers of that carbon cycle that I mentioned previously, how that carbon is stored within the productive, they're potentially going to be greenest, and they'll be storing more carbon. And so I thought to myself, if I could harness the power of the smartphone in everyone's pocket to try and understand how we monitor and track the colors of peatlands, it's a non-destructive method. All I need is a photograph, and I can analyze those photographs to look at the greenness. This is basically just taking the red, green, blue information in the photograph and calculating an index. And it allows me, with my scientific hat on, my research hat on, linking it potentially to how much carbon is being stored by these ecosystems based on some other research that I've done. And so not only is this a really neat scientific project, but it's also an incredibly visual project. And I've got some photographs coming up showing you just how dynamic these ecosystems are. I think historically peatlands and wetlands have been thought of as quite boring compared to other ecosystems, but they change a lot over the course of the year. And so I started this project in Canada when I lived there. I lived in Canada for 3 years before coming to Plymouth. And I started a project on a publicly accessible peatland in Alberta near Grand Prairie with Ducks Unlimited Canada. And so Ducks Unlimited is kind of our version of their version of the Wildfowl Wetlands Trust, the biggest conservation group in Canada, focused specifically on saving their wetlands. And we worked together. They gave me some funding to set up a cradle for a phone. You might have seen similar around here, looking at CoastSnap, for example. But how we can take photographs to track the change in peatlands over time. And so this project's been running for 3 years now, and you can see this is just a snapshot of the photographs. I have hundreds of photographs come through, but you can see the beautiful change in colors in these peatlands and wetlands over time. And so it's a fixed point location. Someone comes along, slides their smartphone into the cradle. It takes the same photograph each time from the same angle, the same distance, and people send them to me, and I can analyze them for their greenness and other types of information from them as well. And not only do people send me their photographs, but what's really nice and what I didn't anticipate from this project is when people are taking the photographs and they email me, they often provide a little snapshot of their day. They tell me why they're on the peatland, what they thought of the peatland, why they think it matters, and how excited they are to be part of a scientific project, so which is a really, really neat thing as well. And so we see here, we've got 2021, 2022, and then this year. And you might notice, keen eyes amongst you, there's a little bit of haze in the photographs. As you've seen from the media, Canada has been on fire this year. And so we've been impacted slightly by wildfire, but there is a big difference. If we see, this is some data, I don't want to bamboozle you with too much data, but we can see over time, we've got the 3 years here, and we see there is a difference in the greenness over time. And so there's some caveats involved. Obviously, it's different types of phones, different times of day. But what's really neat is we can use that color to showcase how these peatlands change over time. And so I've expanded this project recently. We've got the Sustainable Earth Institute at the University of Plymouth, which I know the Arts and Energy Collective are involved with. They gave me some funding to upscale this project to take it global. And so we've got cradles set up in Scotland and Cornwall at the Eden project currently. And then in the future, over winter this year, we're going to set them up in Finland, Sweden, Canada, Germany, France, Ecuador. So to get people involved and really seeing how fantastic these peatlands are and the change in color. And so one of the best ones we've got set up so far is the one in the Flow Country. So as I mentioned earlier, these areas are fantastic areas of blanket bog off in the very north of Scotland, beautiful landscape. And so we've got a frame set up there. We set it up in June. And since then, we've had over 150 photographs of the peatland over time. And this is, again, it's just a snapshot. And so it's a really, really neat project. One of the best things about it is, like I said, getting those emails from people telling me about their day. Why were they on the peatland? What did they enjoy about the peatland? Which is really, really neat. And so that's me. Hopefully I didn't go over time, but if anybody's any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Well, I thank you very much, Scott, and such an interesting example of getting passers-by and communities involved in just engaging and connecting with the peatlands.
Yeah,
really
it's really difficult with carbon, especially because it's an invisible gas. It's invisible. They don't know what it is, and so if you can try and link it to something visual, I think it's very, very, very effective way of getting people to care.
I agree with you. And the Art and Energy Collective has been working up on Dartmoor with communities, doing our very small scale acts of restoration. But in that process, which has involved quite a lot of creativity and making, we have been working with somebody called Angelique McBride, who's part of the Dartmoor Headwaters Project. And Angelique, I was just sort of wondering, really, how have you been going about that sort of restoration work in your project, the Headwaters Project? Well, tell us what it is basically, but then how have you been going about it?
Yeah, sure. I did have a question for Scott, actually.
Oh yeah, do ask me questions.
So the tracking of the colours, has it been on restored peat, or has it just been on peatlands in general?
So at the moment, just intact peatlands, because I have to rely on them being publicly accessible to make sure there's enough foot traffic. I have a project with my collaborators in Canada where we're working with and it's quite contentious here in the UK, the idea of this, but working with the Canadian Sphagnum Peat Association who harvest sphagnum sustainably. But part of their sustainability is to restore. They restore their peat bogs really successfully, and so we're setting up some frames on the restored sites because they have actually some quite nicely accessible peatlands over there. And so I'd be very keen in the future to kind of set up frames at restored sites that have enough foot traffic, or if there's one or two keen people who are going there regularly enough who want to be part of it. Actually, a lot of the times the Canadian one over the last 3 years, this year, because of the fires, a lot of the photographs were just taken by one man and his dog, and he was very keen to send in photographs regularly.
Because that would be very fast, like a really easy citizen science for us in terms of what we've restored, and then have people take photos. I've had this idea about how we track the change, and that might be a way for we can send the data to you, and you could track the changes of the color.
Yeah, I have a box on my desk of tens of phone cradles, so I'm more than happy to get people involved if they've got if they're interested. So yeah, I'll maybe pop your email address somewhere, and I'll be in touch.
Brilliant.
Fantastic. Yeah. So Angelique, what are you doing on the moors then?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll give a bit of an introduction about who I am and the project I'm working on. So I'm a natural flood management officer working for Dartmoor National Park on our Dartmoor Headwaters project. So the Headwaters project works in a few priority catchments around Dartmoor, mainly focused on those areas at risk of flooding. So ultimately, we're really focused on downstream flood risk and how we can mitigate against that. And we use NFM, so natural flood management, to try and bring into our landscape to reduce. Flood management is a way of sort of restoring natural processes and also emulating those natural processes in the landscape. So it'll be things like restoring floodplains, so connecting rivers to their floodplains so that they can flood out and store water on their floodplains instead of just shooting down towards someone's garden and house, unfortunately. And it would also be things like woodland creation, wetland creation, and also what we're talking about today, peatland restoration. So really up in those headwaters. So yeah, that's kind of the project and what natural flood management is all about.
And
oh, you've just gone on mute.
The diagram Scott showed us of the creation of peat showed that sort of the decomposition, the carbon being lost through some decomposition being really slowed down by the ground being wet. And I'm presuming then your main purpose up in the moors to protect that peatland.
To get it wet again. Yeah. So Martin kind of touched on the historical background to Dartmoor, and unfortunately it is that history on Dartmoor is why we're seeing the degradation in our peatlands. So we saw the pictures of the tin streaming, the series of spoil heaps that we saw in a row. So tin streaming was very extensive across Dartmoor. Pretty much every single river on Dartmoor has been tin streamed. And that process completely changes the topography and just the way the river works. Yeah. Really done. It's kind of like pulling the plug on our peatlands, where it's just changed the slope ever so slightly, where water runs off quicker. So we're not holding water better in our peatlands because it's just rushing off. And then what we also have, which I don't think Martin mentioned, was peat cuttings on our deep peat. So this would have been done historically to use as fuel. So they would have drained the peat, made it less wet, and then extracted it, and then use those peat blocks to for household fires, but also industry. So for also those tin mills would have needed energy, so they would have used the peat to keep those tin mills going. So what's happened with those peat cuttings is we've lost all that peat, but they also go straight down the slope. So water again just rushes off, and then when water picks up speed, it picks up erosive power. So it's eroding all that peat and all that carbon straight into our rivers, exposing the peat also to atmosphere. So currently on Dartmoor, a lot of our peat should be storing carbon, but is actually emitting quite a lot of our carbon, which is a shame. So this is where we come in to try and restore that hydrology. So and what we do is that water level is currently a lot lower than it should be. So we'll put in peat bunds, timber blocks, and even trialing some of those wall logs. This is all the work that Southwest Peatland Partnership have been doing. So they're the absolute experts in this. But they would be using all those things to raise that water level to that diagram that Scott showed, to keep that peat wet so that sphagnum can start building carbon and building peat.
Yeah, and when all those bunds are placed across the streams and the overflows from the top of the moor and the water level rises, then once you've got that level, the sphagnum can, I'm going to call rewild, I'm going to call it renaturalize those areas and start creating peat again. Is that
yeah, exactly. So basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to tip the balance for sphagnum to grow. So we're just currently we've got degradation of peat, and sphagnum really struggle in those sorts of environments because it's not wet enough. If we can just tip the balance into a wetter environment, then we can just leave it all up to the sphagnum, and then they do all the work for us. They start storing carbon, they start holding the water, like Scott says, that they hold 20 times their weight in water. That acts as like an amazing sponge for us to not only like hold the water when it rains so it doesn't end up in people's homes, but also as a drought resilience, because it releases the water slowly back into our rivers. So they're brilliant for flood risk and brilliant for drought. They'll start sequestering the carbon for us. Another big issue, which is why Southwest Water are quite interested in restoring our peatlands, so they're one of the eroding peat increases acidification to our rivers, which is really detrimental to our fish populations. And also, whenever you walk across Dartmoor and you see our rivers, they're quite brown. That is from our peat, that is from eroding peat, and that is dissolved organic carbon, and that ends up in our reservoirs, and that ends up as drinking water supply. So Southwest Water spend a lot of money to remove that colour, because I think we'd all get a fright if we turn our taps on and this brown stuff comes out. So they spend a lot of money to try and remove that. So instead of spending it on chemicals, why not restore the peatlands so less of it ends up into our in our waters?
So there's just so many reasons for doing what you're doing, Angelique. How lovely to have a job that has all that potential of solving a real problem, the flooding, the acidification, the degradation, just restoring our beautiful moorlands into a really healthy ecosystem. And I know it's not 100% down to the moss, but because our whole being at the moment is about mosses, it's all down to sphagnum and other small plants.
Absolutely, in our peatlands. But yeah, mosses also play a role in our temperate rainforests as well, so mustn't forget about them.
No, we don't. And Tim showed us some of those. So thanks very much, Angelique, because we are now going to whiz over to Chloe, my colleague Chloe, because I have omitted to tell everybody also that our next mass participation artwork is going to be is Mossy Carpet, and Chloe's going to tell us a bit about that and our latest trying to raise resources to make it 50 meters long, but I'll hand over to her.
Hi, so we're really excited and slightly terrified and not quite sure why we're doing this because we swore we would never do this again. But after our last project, Moths to a Flame, where we had 58,000 people involved in looking at moths, not moths, for inspiration, we've been trying to find a project that would speak to the powers within and help us all find a way to respond to the climate emergency. And over the past 2 years, with people like Angelique, with our partners on Dartmoor, we've been developing the Mossy Carpet, which is currently in its smaller version on display at the Theatre Royal in Plymouth. So if anyone would like to go and have a see of what it looks like at the beginning, then please do. I'm going to show you now our crowdfunder video for the Mossy Carpet, which will help us to grow the carpet. And I've got to share my screen. So I'm going to do that. And I'm going to make sure I'm sharing sound. So this is our crowdfunder platform, which we'll share in the chat. And it tells you we're trying to raise £30,000. We've got 35 days left in order to try and do that. And everyone is very welcome to come and have a look at this crowdfunder site. And here is, hopefully this will work, the video for the project.
Hello, we're from the Art and Energy Collective, an award-winning group of artists who design mass participation artworks in response to the climate emergency. We're asking for help to make our ambitious new artwork, the Mossy Carpet. Through this crowdfunder, we hope to raise over £30,000 to allow us to work with thousands of people in and around Plymouth to make 50 metres of the Mossy Carpet for a celebration of local climate actions in 2024.
The climate and ecological emergency is the giant of our times, but we know that many people are making brilliant changes in their lives and communities to take steps towards a brighter, greener future. The Mossy Carpet celebrates this to give us hope and new ideas for what we could do in our own lives. Now lately, we've been working with communities on Dartmoor to restore parts of the carbon-rich peatland, and we've been inspired by how tiny mosses nurture all of life. We've developed this artwork to highlight how many tiny actions can together be beautiful and make a big difference.
So here's how you can help. You can make a small donation to help support Mossy Carpet workshops and to make it possible for us to take the carpet to festivals and events. You could fund an entire Mossy Carpet workshop for a school or a community group, or you could nab yourself one of our limited edition tardigrades.
These donations will be tripled by Aviva's Save Our Wild Isles Fund. So if you donate just the price of a cup of coffee, the project will receive a tenner. The Mossy Carpet already looks awesome, and people ask us what we plan to do with it. So far, it's 12 metres long and has been made by 5,000 people. But your donations will help us continue this creativity and have conversations about climate with thousands more people, culminating in an event in the summer to celebrate local climate action. You could nominate someone who's done something really special to take a walk of fame along this carpet at that special event.
And of course, you can also get involved creatively too by making a pom-pom or recording a message to add to the carpet. Have a look at our website for more information.
Thank you so much for watching this film, and please share it with your friends or family or your communities.
We hope you've been inspired to support the Mossy Carpet and to use art to celebrate everyone's steps towards a brighter, greener future.
There we go. Now, I really hope that there's something in there in our set of rewards that might tempt you to support the project. There's all sorts of things like supporting a school or a community group to have a day-long workshop, or you can get yourself a tardigrade, or you can come along to one of our events. And I know that we'll be going on a mossy walk at some point, which will be really fun.
There's the Mossy Walk is in February, led by Tim, and it'll be around Plymouth and showing us some of those mosses that he showed us earlier.
By the way, I do promise I have changed since making that video. I know I'm wearing the same jumper. I definitely have done other things as well since making the video.
Yeah. The what we find, Chloe, with the mossy carpet is that there's so many different ways of joining in with it, isn't it? So you can be completely hooked on mosses, can't you? Be inspired by them and notice them and create pieces for the mossy carpet that reflect those mosses that you've got interested in, whether they're pom-pom sphagnum mosses or whether they're the little screw moss on the walls.
Absolutely, you're right. And the thing is that, you know, what we're all talking about essentially is a response to the climate and ecological emergency. And we talked about the huge value of tiny unnoticed mosses. And I think lots of people can be quite overwhelmed by the enormity of the challenge. But when we go small and think about mosses and we start thinking about all of the tiny actions that we can all take, all the different sorts of things that we can all do, it can be really exciting, and it can be really hopeful to be reminded that each and every person in this room is doing something. And by focusing on what we're doing and the positive and the hope, and hopefully we can all encourage everyone else to join in too.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought I could just give a quick recommendation. I've got this book, Gathering Mosses, by Robin Wall Kammerer. It's brilliant. It is so good, and it goes through all the different mosses, and then sort of like at the end, it kind of tells a story about what that moss is, or how she's come about studying it. So I highly recommend it. And there's a lovely bit in there about sphagnum mosses and how much of a superhero they are.
Yeah, there is. She manages to translate the stories and science of mosses into the human behaviors and our role in living with those mosses as an equal species, doesn't she? It's really a very good book indeed. So I think that we've now come to the end of our show this evening, where we have had a close look at mosses from outside your front door up on top of the moors. Such a wide range of bryophytes to get into with Tim Purchase, and I'm sure we'll invite him back if he'll come, and we'll have the presentation available on the website. And then we moved into the what do we do next? We then had Martin talk about the archaeology and the history of the peat and the role of mosses in holding that peat, growing that peat, which traps the whole story of the landscape through thousands of years. We moved then in with Scott telling us a bit more about how the carbon sequestration happens and how important that peat is directly in relation to the carbon, and I was going to say the carbon emergency, the climate emergency. And then finally we have talked to Angelique about the work, such important work that she's doing as well on top of the moors, holding the water levels back up so that the mosses can grow, so there's no flooding. But there's all those other things that I hadn't quite registered to do with the acidity and the carbon being washed away out of the moors. So all in all, it's been a really great hour of learning and being inspired, and we hope that you might come back on the 11th of December for more about mosses and about the project that we're all involved in. And also in that month, some of you might tell your friends about the Mossy Carpet and the crowdfunder and help us extend it by 50 metres all through next year, well, all through the summer and hold a big celebration of the local actions that people are taking. So thank you very much.